This video provides a short overview of the Foundations of Communication Competency for TJC, Elements of Effective Communication, and its objective assessment. The Foundations of Communication covers content from chapters 1 through 5 in the e-text for the course, Communication Principles for a Lifetime by Beebe, and Ivy. And in the course of study, we're covering content from about up here to Introduction to Communication Concepts down to Listening and Responding. So this first section here is all about the foundations of communication and its processes. So let's navigate to the e-text here. If we start with Chapter 1, Foundations of Communication, we'll see that much of the emphasis in the book when it comes to communication factors is about how all of the different elements of communication come together in what's called the 5 principles of communication. This is actually starting on page 22 of the text. And you'll see here in this pentagon the 5 principles of communication laid out quite nicely. It's comprised of being aware of your own communication with yourself and others, the effective use and interpretation of both verbal and nonverbal messages, appropriately adapting your messages to others, and then listening and responding to others appropriately. So listening, responding, and perception checking play a big role in this competency. If we are to be better listeners and interpreters of communication messages, then we will also be better communicators ourselves. So that is a big thematic element throughout the whole text, and it's really introduced in its entirety in Chapter 1. The rest of Chapter 1 covers such aspects such as our communication models, or the way in which we understand the complexity of the communication processes, and characteristics of communicating in the everyday life today. So communicating in the 21st century, for example, talks about mediated and face-to-face communication and the unique context that we find ourselves in. So moving on to Chapter 2 is all about self-awareness and perception and how it influences our communication choices and patterns. We want you to pay particular attention to the stages of perception in the perception process, which is starting on page 49 here. And also perception checking, or how we communicate to enhance your powers of perception, starting on page 53. Increasing your awareness, avoiding stereotypes, and perception checking, both indirect and direct. It's going to be a very important topic to cover in this particular chapter. Chapter 3 covers verbal messaging and how we understand our verbal messages. So it describes not only the mechanics of our communication, such as encoding and decoding, symbol creation and use, but the power of our verbal messages. There's even a section on the power of our words here. So we want you to make sure to reflect upon the power of verbal messaging and the ethical and responsive use of our verbal messages in both written and spoken discourse. Chapter 4 is about understanding nonverbal messages. So why should we focus on nonverbal communication in the first place? Why is it so important? And how do we communicate nonverbally? So again, perception checking is going to play a really big role in this chapter as we learn how and why people use nonverbals as they do, and how we can look at them holistically in the context of our verbal messaging. So this section, particularly on how to interpret nonverbal cues more accurately, is really going to tie together all of the how behind our nonverbals really nicely. And finally, in this competency is Chapter 5, Listening and Responding. Listening well revolves around responding with empathy. So empathy is not only an emotional response, but it is a behavioral and cognitive practice. So the chapter builds on, first, how do we listen? What types of styles do we take on as we listen to others? And what are barriers to our listening? And how can we improve our listening skills? All of this is meant to develop better relationships. So that is, all of this help us to choose to listen well to someone else, because we're not always inclined to be good listeners since we get so distracted so easily. So things like adjusting our nonverbal behaviors to show immediacy and interest, as well as asking questions, paraphrasing, and keeping an open mind for options to respond appropriately, are all ways that we can improve our listening skills. And that moves us really nicely into the next competency about adapting to others and maintaining contextual relationships both interpersonally and in small group contexts. But that is the basic foundation of this course. The foundations of communication is all about these first 5 chapters. So if at any time you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. There's a Contact Your Course Mentor button here in the course of study. You can call us at extension 1756 or email us at com@wgu.edu. Best of luck with studying.